Hello everyone, my name is Andrea Miller and I am a master's student at the University of Alberta. Today I'll be presenting my research to date on Indigenous-owned renewable energy in Alberta, Canada. Settler-Indigenous relations in Canada are rooted in the numbered treaties. 11 treaties were signed between Indigenous nations and the Crown, and these treaties are in place across many of Canada's provinces and territories, in addition to numerous other signed agreements. The University of Alberta, and this project, is situated in the Prairie Province of Alberta, which sits at the intersection of Treaty 6, 7, and 8. Today I am situated on Treaty 6 land, in yellow on the map. I'm coming to you from Edmonton, Amiskwaciwâskahigon, or Beaver Hills House, the homeland of the Papa's Chase and the historic and present territory of many Indigenous nations. I do this land acknowledgement to emphasize the significance of this place and to situate myself in this research as a settler having grown up here. I invite you to take this opportunity to reflect on the land on which you are situated and the original inhabitants of that place. Indigenous peoples in Canada entered into these numbered treaties as sovereign nations, with established forms of government and ways of life. The relationships of respect and mutual benefit outlined in the treaties are very different to the reality of Canada's colonial history, a history that pervades today. More recently, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission outlined 94 calls to action, which lay out the pathway for acknowledging the truth of that colonial history, as well as concrete actions that can move us towards reconciliation. All Canadians have a responsibility as treaty people to uphold this relationship. Particularly salient to my discussion today is the 92nd call to action, which outlines a baseline of free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding with any economic development projects, and calls for Indigenous communities to be the long-term beneficiaries of these projects through equitable access to jobs, training, and other opportunities. Similar principles are outlined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada has not yet ratified. In Alberta, these economic development projects primarily take the form of natural resource extraction and fossil fuel energy development in close proximity to Indigenous communities and territories. Oil sands development has provided benefits, including job creation, revenue, and community infrastructure. But this industry is associated with environmental, social, and economic impacts for First Nation and Métis communities. Natural environments and wildlife have been degraded beyond recovery, and Indigenous rights are infringed upon when communities enter into agreements with multinational corporations and free, prior, and informed consent is not upheld. In Alberta, the newly elected provincial government's mandate to build a highly contested pipeline and the recent repeal of environmental monitoring regulations for oil sands projects serve as daily reminders of the government's priorities and the denial of the reality of energy transition. In Alberta, only 12% of our electricity needs are met from a renewable source, following our primary sources of coal and natural gas. But the province has outlined a commitment to 30% renewable electricity by the year 2030. It is within this context that the current research locates. There is a great opportunity for Indigenous communities to create their own energy narratives as leaders in an inclusive, just energy transition. Community energy projects are defined in the literature as those projects that are developed, owned, and operated by members of communities that have been brought together by geography or by a shared interest. This process is open and collaborative, with community engagement often leading to greater support for projects, and all community members seeing the immediate benefits at the local scale. Increasingly, Indigenous communities across Canada are pursuing renewable energy projects where they act as planners, managers, owners, and beneficiaries. Majority Indigenous-owned renewable energy projects challenge the legacy of oil and gas energy development in Alberta, the impacts of which are disproportionately felt by communities while seeing few of the local benefits. Scholars have mapped the Indigenous energy landscape across Canada, most recently identifying 307 developing or completed renewable energy projects in 194 communities. Most of the projects are located to the west in British Columbia or to the east in Ontario, with a relatively small number located here in Alberta. Many of the projects in Alberta were made possible after a landmark provincial election in 2015. After 40 years of Conservative government, the new Democratic Party, the NDP, was elected and governed the province for 4 years. The NDP implemented a first-of-its-kind climate leadership program. Opportunities for Indigenous communities came in the form of the Indigenous Climate Leadership Program and the Renewable Electricity Program. These programs targeted the areas of climate change capacity building and planning, energy efficiency retrofits, energy assessment, community-owned solar and wind initiatives, and green employment. However, in spring 2019, the newly elected United Conservative Party and Premier Jason Kenney cut the Indigenous Climate Leadership Program in the first provincial budget and closed the Renewable Electricity Program to any further project bids. The current policy landscape at the intersection of Indigenous governance, climate leadership, and renewable energy is sparse. With this background in mind, the current research explores what this political landscape means for Indigenous participation in a just energy transition, and what we can learn from Indigenous communities who have completed successful renewable energy projects in Alberta. I ask, what role do Indigenous-owned renewable energy projects have to play in Alberta's energy transition, and how does an Indigenous ownership stake support further Indigenous participation in the renewable energy sector? I also introduce a case study of solar energy initiatives in Enoch Cree Nation, Alberta, which aims to understand how community members envision energy transition. This work is informed by a community-based participatory research approach. Community-based research challenges the top-down nature of research by addressing power imbalances and amplifying the lived experience of participants. It follows the research protocols of respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility, and those principles inform each stage of the research. Ownership, control, access, and possession, or OCAP, are also foundational to this research. Interview participants retain ownership over the knowledge they share, control their level of involvement in the research, have access to their knowledge at any time, and in the case of the partner community, all research materials are kept within the community with the community research assistant to ensure that possession is retained. Research to date is in phase 1 and has involved semi-structured key informant interviews. These conversations have taken place with representatives from Alberta First Nations and Métis communities and governance bodies, environment and climate advocates, energy consultants, and solar contractors. A key informant approach is being taken initially to situate the community case study within a body of knowledge on Indigenous-owned renewable energy projects in Alberta. The case study outlined in Phase 2 is a research partnership with Enoch Cree Nation. I began conversations in summer 2019 with the nation's then Environmental Stewardship Coordinator, as well as my now community advisor. I'm also working together with a community research assistant, currently an undergraduate student at the University of Alberta and a member of the Enoch Youth Council. She is my partner in this research and has been central in her role approaching interview participants, conducting interviews, and identifying community needs and priorities to co-create this case study together with me. Today, I'll be sharing some of the findings to date from Phase 1, the key informant interviews. Participants see the energy transition as inevitable. It will happen whether or not the provincial government is planning for it. It is a movement with real momentum that is already happening, just at smaller scales, within municipalities and in Indigenous communities. Those in the renewable energy sector are motivated by their values and persist in spite of an often uphill battle, facing opposition from those in positions of power. But majority Indigenous-owned renewable projects are still situated in a larger system of governance and an energy sector that is rooted in a colonial history and present-day ignorance. Without meaningful relationship building based in trust, these projects still exist within that system. An inclusive energy transition needs to involve Indigenous communities as equal partners, with real collective negotiating power. Communities need to come together in unity, with the idea that collective power will lead to collective benefit. But there is a steep learning curve. This is partly due to the fact that no model exists for these projects, and communities are learning as they go. But a growing number of renewable energy advocates across the country and communities with successful projects has created a valuable network within which to share knowledge. There is further opportunity for knowledge sharing to take place, with engineers and solar technicians sharing scientific knowledge, being woven together with traditional knowledge, positioning Indigenous communities as experts in their own right. Building the technical capacity within the community to install, operate, and maintain these projects ensures that the relationship with solar energy companies leads to long-lasting benefits, contrary to the energy projects of the past. This represents a new relationship between communities and energy companies and has the opportunity to redefine the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the energy sector in this province. It specifically has the potential to implement the 90-second Truth and Reconciliation call to action, which calls on the business community to not only create these long-term benefits, but also take responsibility for their own learning to move forward in good relations with Indigenous peoples in this country. Community members trained and employed as solar installers builds in a sense of ownership over the project to maintain it for the long term. There is also a sense of community pride that comes from investing in job creation within the community. In this way, community ownership is much more than a legal mechanism. Still, the value of ownership to a community should be considered on a case-by-case basis. Some communities consider it a key part of the process. For others, ownership means assuming the financial risk and liability of these projects. Regardless of the legal ownership structure in place, an important first step is taking ownership over the project and having pride in it. This comes from having community buy-in and involving the community in each phase of the process. These are generational projects that will have a significant place in the community, lasting 20, 30 years into the future. As this project moves forward into Phase 2, I ask, how do community members envision renewable energy development and energy transition in Enoch Cree Nation? Enoch Cree Nation is a First Nation located west of the city of Edmonton, 20 minutes from the University of Alberta main campus. Enoch is in the feasibility stages of a large-scale solar project within their territory, as well as solar home retrofits in the community. We want to engage with community members to understand their motivations, challenges, and larger vision for energy transition. Thank you very much for your time and attention.